Welcome to part 79 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.7. In this tutorial, I'll be talking about texture painting. This is a topic that's well overdue in this tutorial series. This is again number 79 in this whole Blender 2.7 tutorial series in how to create 3D models and animations for the purpose of creating a scene or short animation in Blender. If you have not seen the rest of this tutorial series, go ahead and check it out. I'll put a link to the entire tutorial series on the screen right now. And hey, if you learned something in this video, go ahead and click on that like button. And if you want to see more videos just like this one in Blender, go ahead and click on that subscribe button down below this video on YouTube as well. So in this tutorial, we're going to be dividing it up into two parts. In the first half of this video, I'm going to be talking about all the tools you need to texture paint in Blender. That means you can actually paint in the 3D viewport. I'll click on my splash screen to get rid of it. You can actually paint on an object in the 3D viewport, or you can paint on a flat surface on the texture that is on the 3D object. I'll be going over many of the tools, not all of them, but most of them that you'll need to at least get started in texture painting in Blender. So that means you do not actually need a separate graphics program like Photoshop or GIMP. You can actually do all of your texture painting in Blender. Let's go ahead and start off by working with this default cube. In order to add a texture to the cube, you need to actually have an image on it. So the first thing I'll do is I'm going to divide this window up a little bit differently on my screen, or at least my user interface here. I'm going to get rid of this timeline. We won't be doing any animation in this tutorial at all, so I'll go ahead and right click on the line between those two windows, right click and say join area, and if I put my mouse in this one and click, that window, the timeline, will disappear. I'm going to go ahead and left click and drag on this little triangle area up here, and left click and drag it straight down to divide the 3D viewport into two. And I'm going to go ahead and do that again, but I'll drag this one to the left. So left click and drag to split this upper window into two. I'm going to make this window over here into a node editor window. The node editor window is used to customize material, and in this video you'll learn how to use it to customize texture brushes. So the node editor option is right there when you click on this button, and I'll change this window into a UV image editor window. This is where we actually have to unwrap an object that we unwrap, or a mesh that we unwrap, and it's also where we can create and paint images. So the UV image editor window. Let's go ahead and add a material to the cube, and before I do that though, I'm going to switch my render engine up here at the top from Blender Render to Cycles Render. That means that the way that we apply all of the materials will be different, so make sure you're using Cycles just like me. In order to add a material to this object, we have to go up to the Material tab with the cube selected, and I'm going to get rid of this old material because I believe it's an old Blender internal render engine material. So I'll click on this minus, I'll click on the new, now that we're in the Cycles render engine, and when we do that, we should be able to see these nodes. I can scroll up in this window to see the nodes of this material. If you're not familiar with how to create materials in the Blender Cycles, or if you don't understand nodes, I'll put a link to my material on getting started with Blender Cycles materials and nodes up at the top of the screen right now. So what I need to do here is I have a basic material. It's basically an almost white diffuse material, but into this diffuse material I'm going to plug an image texture. So in this window I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to add a texture after pressing Shift A. That brings up the add menu. It'll be a texture and an image texture, and I can put that little node right there, and I'll plug the color of the image into the diffuse color port right there just by clicking and dragging. Now at this point we want to bring in an image, but we're going to be creating our image by painting an image, but we still need an image on the cube. So I'm actually going to create a new image file right inside of Blender. Yes, you can do that. That's why we have the UV image editor window. So what I'll do is I'll click on new down here. And once I do that, it brings up a few options. I'm going to pick a base color, so that's the color right there. I can click, and then I get a color palette. It's set to black by default, but I can bring that up. I'm going to pick like a baby blue right about there. I'm going to call this cube texture, and I'm happy with 1024 by 1024. If you're creating something very important for like a game or an animation, you might want to pick double that, so 2048 by 2048. I'll just leave it as it is, and I'll click on OK. It zooms in by default, so I can scroll up and down to zoom out. Great. I cannot see it on the cube yet for a couple of reasons. The first reason is we actually have to pick the image over here in the image texture node. So I'll do that. I can click on this little picture icon and select that cube texture image that we just made. And in this window, I have to change my shading. Right now it's set to solid viewport shading down here. And I'm going to change it right now from solid to material. And there you can see I have the blue material, the image rather, on the cube. There's one problem though still. I need to unwrap this cube because it does not know how to properly put what parts of this image onto what sides of the cube. If you're not familiar with how to do UV mapping in Blender, I'll put a link on the screen right now to my tutorial in UV mapping. In that tutorial, as you can see from the thumbnail, I unwrap a cube and paint a texture, a letter block texture with A, B, C, D, E, and F on all sides of the cube, like a child's toy. We'll be doing something like that in this video right now before we go ahead and move on to the second part of this video in which we create a donut. So let's go ahead, and with the cube selected, I'll press tab on my keyboard to go into edit mode, and we're just going to do a quick and dirty unwrap here. So what I'll do is I'll press U on my keyboard with everything selected. I'll press A a few times to make sure everything's selected. I'll tap U, and I'm going to select Smart UV Project. That'll do my seams for me. So I'll click on Smart UV Project, and I'm going to turn the island margin. I'm actually going to hold Shift on my keyboard and left click and drag in there. So this value becomes 0.03 or so. It doesn't really matter, but something very, very small like that. And I'll click on OK. So now all the faces of the cube get laid out for me as if I had created seams on all the edges up here in the UV image editor window. Perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this image. It's a blue image. It doesn't have much in it, but it needs to be saved. So I'm actually going to go to this image menu, and I'm just going to say pack as PNG. And what packing means is it actually saves the image file. PNG is a common image format like JPEG or GIF. It'll save the PNG image as a part of this Blender file. So I'll click on pack as PNG, and now I'm going to actually save this whole Blender file. So I'll go to File and Save As, and then on my desktop, I'm going to call this one B27-79-001. This is the 79th tutorial in this Blender 2.7 tutorial series. So great. It's at this point that I can start painting. I can do that in two places in Blender. The first place I can do it is up here in the UV image editor window. It actually has a painting feature built in. So I'm going to make all the other areas of my screen smaller. I'll drag this edge over. It doesn't matter that side panel disappeared. I don't really need that anymore. So in this window, I can change my mode from the view mode down here to paint. Yes, we can actually paint in here. And when you do that, you can see that on your mouse cursor it becomes a circle. That's your brush. And if you left click and drag, yes, you can start painting. Your color palette is hidden by default. It's in the side toolbar panel, which you can click on this little plus to see. There we go. You can see your brush right here. It's set to text draw. That's just normal drawing by default. If you click in this little thumbnail, you can get access to different brushes. We're not going to touch on all of these in this video. We'll just touch upon basically text draw and the clone brush and maybe fill as well. Below the brush thumbnail is your color palette with two colors. We'll only be getting into the first color in this video. There is the blending mode of the brush. By default it's set to mix, which is just sort of the default mode of painting. That is just normal color output. If you're familiar with blend modes in Photoshop or in GIMP or other similar graphics programs, you'll be right at home here. You'll recognize things like pin light, vivid light, overlay, multiply, add, mix, subtract, etc. I'll just go ahead and leave that on mix. We will be getting into using texture brushes and texture masks in this video, so we got a lot to do. Let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to press Ctrl Z a few times to undo because I want to make a block of letters. So I can orbit with my mouse wheel pressed down, just like a button. I can now orbit or pan this around. That's great. Let's go ahead and pick a color. I'll pick red. To change my brush size, I can change that right here. It's called the radius, so I can make it smaller. I can turn up the strength, which is the opacity, how see-through or solid the color is. I can also press F on my keyboard, and if I tap F, I can now move my mouse out, and you can see that circle expanding as well as the brush preview size expanding. So I can make it big, I can tap F, I can make it small again. Let's go ahead and tap F, and I'll make it about that big, and let's go ahead and draw a letter A as best as I can quickly. Great, so the F key brings up the size of the brush. You can also tap Shift F, and that will bring up the opacity keyboard shortcut. So if I move my mouse in towards the middle of this circle, it'll turn up to 1, which is at full opacity or full strength. If I pull out, I can make it go to 0, which is totally transparent, which is not really accurate in terms of that preview. So if I go to just a little bit in from the very outside, I get a very, very subtle red. If I press, I'll press Control Z though to undo that. If I press Shift F and go into the middle, you can see I get a fully opaque or fully solid color of my choice. I'll go ahead and undo that. For the next side, I'm going to write the letter B, but I'm going to use a different method of drawing. I'm going to pick a different color though, so I'm going to choose green, I believe. I'm not going to just draw. I could press F and make a smaller brush and draw a letter B, but I don't want to do that. I want to make it very, very clean. So I'm going to draw with a line and a curve. So to do that, I'm not going to use this typical style of drawing called the space style or the space stroke. And basically what that means is under paint stroke down here, I'm actually going to drag this up to just below the colors. You can rearrange these sections. This space stroke method, basically as you're holding your left mouse button down and moving your mouse, it's sort of spacing circles very, very close together. And the speed or the spacing is set to 10% right now. If you're finding, if I press Control Z many times, if you're finding that you're going really fast and you're getting kind of it spaced out too much, or maybe a bit less than that, maybe something like that, and you can see the little circles, you might want to turn your spacing down from the default 10 down to something like 5 or so, and that way you'll get a cleaner line as you're drawing. But I don't want to use space. I'm going to use a line. When I select line, I can no longer click and drag and just draw freehand, but I can left click and drag straight down, and you can see a dotted line, and if I let go, it draws a straight line for me. So if you want to draw straight lines, that's how you can do it. Similarly, if you want to draw curves, you can use the curve stroke method. And if you're not sure how to use Bezier curves, like if you're using a vector graphics program like Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator, or Inkscape, I'll put a link to my tutorial on how to use Bezier curves and curves on the screen right now. So in that video, I cover how to use the Bezier handles in quite good depth. But let's go ahead and create a curve. To do that, when I have my stroke method set to curve, I can hold the Control key down on my keyboard and left click and drag, and that will create my Bezier curve handle and point. And then I'm going to go maybe to the next point down, left click and drag that out. I'm not going to do a very good B here, and I'll go down to here and I'll left click and drag that out. At this point I can left click each of the points, and I can kind of make them look the way I want. And when I'm ready to make this actually a green line that gets made of paint, what I can do, after I kind of fix these up a little bit, is I can press enter on my keyboard, and that will create the line. I can press enter many more times. In fact, I can press A several times to select all of these, and I can press G and I can move this. I can even tap R to rotate it, and I can press enter at any point. If I want to make it M later on, I don't want to, so I'll press Control Z. I'll press X on my keyboard with those selected to get rid of them. Let's go ahead and move on to the third side with the letter C. I should mention at this point though that you can actually change the style or the feather amount on the brush that you have, and that's called the paint curve. I'm going to actually move that section up to just below paint stroke. I'm going to change my stroke method back to space, and I'll change my spacing up to 10 like it was at default, and I'll collapse that. The paint curve describes the shape of your brush. If I tap F to make my brush bigger, you can see how feathered that brush is. It has quite a big feather, and that's because of this curve. This curve on the left side describes how transparent the middle of the circle of the brush is. So this point right there is set to the very highest opacity, and so it fades out to the outside of the circle down to nothing. This describes the outside of the circle. This describes the middle of the circle, so the radius is right there. If I change my paint curve to this one, you can see this is a straight line. So if I just click to draw one brush, you can see that it fades very evenly evenly in a linear fashion from the middle, which is solid, all the way out to the edge of the circle, which is totally transparent. I'll press Control Z. This one, you'll see it's very, very solid up until the very edge, so it has a very small feathered area right there. And this one, and I'll press Control Z. This last one is totally solid all the way out to the very edge of the circle, just like that. Let's go ahead and press Control Z. I'll tap F on my keyboard to make the brush head smaller. I'm going to pick a different color. I'm going to pick pink, and I'm going to draw my letter. Now at this point, I want to talk about blending modes. I'm not going to go into very high depth on how to use the different blend modes in this video. You can experiment for these on your own. There are a few that I want to talk about though, and the first one is darken, and there are several you can actually use to darken parts of your image. What I like to do for texturing and drawing image textures is actually change this to a darker color of the same color I'm working on, or maybe even black. And if you use this darken value and turn the strength of your brush down, of course I can press Shift F to something like that, and I'll change the paint curve to something more soft like that one. That's the softest brush right there. I can actually paint with that darken mode, shadows or just sort of a bevel on a letter. That's a really, really bad example. I'm going to change my strength down. I'll press Shift F on my keyboard. I'm going to make it very, very transparent down to maybe 0.1 or maybe even smaller. And now if I kind of draw around the contour of my letter, I'm going to speed this part of the video up. Alright, so as you can see, after I did a few passes tracing the outline of the sea, my sea sort of looks like it has some shading on it now and some shadows, and it looks like it's a little bit embossed right now. I could really sell this effect by using another mode, not darken, but screen, and if I use the white color and leave my strength quite low, if I press F and make my brush a little bit smaller and trace over, I'm going to make it a little bit more intense than that. Shift F and I'll turn it up a little bit. If I use screen, it'll actually make white make a nice highlight on your materials or colors. So there we go. It looks like it's a very rounded letter C, at least when you're backed off, or if you had spent more time on it than me, you could get a very, very good result. Let's go ahead and move on. For these last three sides of my cube, I'm actually not going to paint any more in this UV image editor window. Instead, I'm actually going to save this image. I'm going to repack it as a PNG from that image window. You can see if this image or any image is saved that you have currently open. When there's a little star next to the image menu, that means you need to save. Even if you saved your file, I don't believe this will be saved, so you have to make sure to do that manually. So pack as PNG. Instead of painting in this window now, I'm going to move on to painting these last three sides in the actual 3D viewport, and this is done in a very similar way. Instead of being in object mode or edit mode in this case, I'm going to switch over to a texture paint mode, and what that will allow me to do is you'll see right here I get a very similar set of tools to up here. I can paint on objects in 3D. It's just as easy as that. In fact, it might be a little bit easier in some circumstances because I'm going to press Control Z and redo that. I can actually paint over and across faces, and if you look at the image texture up here, you can see this would have been very difficult to do, squiggling across and making an even flow across faces, because these faces are not next to each other when they're laid out in a UV map like I have here. So let's go ahead and continue. What I can actually do in this window is specify as well what faces I want to work with if I don't want to bleed across from one face to another. So I'm going to press Control Z to undo that. To select what faces I want to actually specifically paint on, and I'll make that window quite a bit bigger, is I can use this button down here with the checkerboard on that single face. When I have this button dark, it means I can right click to select individual faces. If I want to select multiple, I can hold Shift and right click. If I have a face selected, I can not paint off of it, so it's going to be limited my painting to that selected face or faces if you have many faces selected. So let's go ahead and paint this entire face a different color. I'm going to choose an orange color. I'm going to press F and make my brush quite a bit bigger. I can paint. Oops, I still have my blend mode set to screen. I'll change that to mix again and change my strength up to 1. I'll paint this face orange, and I'm going to change my color to, let's say, a light blue color. I'll tap F to make my brush smaller, and let's make this a letter D, like that. Perfect, nice and messy. Let's move on to the next side of the cube for letter E. It's at this point that I don't want to limit myself to just painting with colors. I want to paint with textures. There are two ways that you can do that in these painting tools in Blender. The first is called a texture brush, and the second is called a texture mask brush. And there's a difference between these two, although depending on what blend modes you use, you can actually make either one of them do very, very similar things. Let's talk about a texture brush first. When you first open this section called texture, you're presented with this checkerboard, which looks a lot like this checkerboard up here in the properties window. In fact, in the old Blender render engine, you used to use this checkerboard tab a lot more. Nowadays, though, it's mostly used just for this purpose and for similar purposes where you're actually using a texture to do other things besides just adding a texture to a material. In this case, we're going to make a texture into a brush. And how we do that is I can click on new right here, and that will create a new texture. I'm going to name it so it doesn't get confusing for me. So I'm going to call this letter E, and I'll press enter. So now to customize this brush, we don't get very many options over here. We actually have to jump over here to the checkerboard tab in the properties window, and it actually does not have it selected for us. So I'll change this little pull down menu to the letter E. That's why we named it purposely, so we knew where to find it. And by default in this version of Blender, it defaults the type of texture to an image or movie file. I believe in older versions of Blender it defaulted to a cloud texture. Now it's not. So I'm going to change the type of texture, and I've got many choices here. I can select clouds, marble, noise, musgrave, voronoi. I still haven't learned how to say that word, voronoi or voronoi. So I'm going to select voronoi. Let's go ahead and use that. And so now if I paint, I'm going to make my brush a bit bigger. I'll tap F on my keyboard, and I'm actually going to make my color white again. We'll see why in just a moment. So I'll drag, I'll click on that little area, and I'll drag red and green and blue all the way back to 1 each. So now we get all ones is white. So now if I paint, oh wait, we still have that top face selected. I'm going to turn this limit selection. Actually, I'm just going to right click on that face so we can paint on it. If I paint, you can see we get that texture, that voronoi texture on just that side of the cube. Now, the reason why I changed my first color here to white is because it will mix this first color. That's why we have this mix here with this voronoi texture, whatever texture you have selected. I'm going to change this texture to a clouds texture, and if I paint with that, you can see what it looks like. By the way, the scale of your texture will depend on a few things. It'll depend on how big your brush is. So if I tap F and make my brush bigger and paint again, you can see the texture is bigger. If I tap F and make the brush smaller, it'll again be smaller. But even with the brush at the same size, even if I zoom in just a little tiny bit and I paint again with that texture, it'll be a different scale. This makes painting with textures quite difficult in this window, especially if you're orbiting around to different sides and you want to keep consistent. This side is now a different distance away from my view than this is, so it'll be a different scale. Even if I had that one selected, you can see that you might have a very hard time blending these two sides together, but we'll get to that a little bit later. We will solve that problem, at least to some extent. Let's go ahead and press Ctrl Z a couple of times, and I'll select that face again. As I said, this color blends together with your texture. In this case, it's blending using the mix mode. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. If I change this color to, let's say, a pinky ready color, and I paint again, you can see, and in fact, I'm going to change the size of my brush with the F key. You can see it's blending together mostly the white or lighter color of the cloud material with that color that I have selected. You can play around with different blend modes. The other thing you can do when you're painting with a texture is change the brush mapping. And basically what that means is, the best way I can describe it is how the texture will be laid out on your 3D object. By default, this is set to tiled, and that will mean that when you're painting, it will be a different scale. The texture will be a different scale depending on how close you are to the object and based on the size of your brush. And you can also change the size down here. If I want it to be tighter together or a much smaller cloud texture, I can make that much smaller. I can hold shift to to get more precise the value that I want, or I can type a value in there, of course. The other style of brush mapping that I would use besides tiled is 3D and stencil. We'll get into stencil in just a few moments, but with 3D, what it does is it makes it more consistent across your entire mesh. So I'm going to change the size of my cloud texture, so I'll tap F on my keyboard to make my brush smaller and therefore the texture smaller. If I paint again, you can see that even if I zoom out, it will not change the scale of my clouds, and it might be, depending on how you're rotated towards the face that you're currently painting on, it might make it more even and predictable. I believe if you use tiled and you paint on the surface of a face and you're not facing the face straight on, you can see that from this angle the clouds look perfect, but if I orbit around, you can see the clouds look quite stretched and distorted. So that's one of the benefits of using 3D. You'll have to play around to decide in what situation which brush mapping mode works best for you. I'm going to repaint this with 3D set, and let's go ahead and change that cloud texture to, I'm going to choose voronoi again. You have options for voronoi. I'll go ahead and change the color of my brush, and I'll tap F to make it smaller, and I'll write the letter E just like that. Good. On the last face, of course, I have A, B, C, D, and E. I'm going to write F. Before I do that, though, I'm going to paint a starry night background on this face, and to do that, I'm going to create a custom brush using nodes. So I'm going to make this window shorter, and I'm going to make my node editor window wider, right like that. Now, to create a custom brush, you're not going to use material nodes or the object setting. We're going to switch over to the texture mode and then the brush setting right there. Right now I have the letter E brush selected, but it's not actually set up using nodes. I'm actually going to press this little X button to get rid of it from this window. I'll click on New. And when I create a new brush, again, it's not set up to use nodes, so I'm going to click on use nodes just like that. And when you first create a brush, and I'm going to name this brush stars like that, it first defaults to checker. In fact, if you have a brush, let's say I switched over to the letter E brush, if I click on use nodes, it'll actually destroy the brush and make it into a checker brush as well. So I'll press Control Z, or I'll just undo that. I guess it's kind of ruined at this point. Oh well. Let's go ahead and switch back to the stars brush. I'm going to get rid of this checker node, so I'll select it and I'll press X on my keyboard. To make a starry night texture, I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard to bring up the add menu. I'm going to add that voronoi or voroni node just like that. This one has many options. We're not going to play with too many of them. I'm going to plug the color port into the color input port of the output of the texture. And as you can see over here, it's set to brush because I made a brush texture node set up over here. Now, this does not look a lot like stars yet, but this is why we're using the node editor window, is because we can add more nodes in the middle of this noodle to make it look just like stars. First off, you can see that we have basically little orbs or little cells that are black with white in between them, which sort of looks like the inverse of stars to some extent. So I'm actually going to invert the colors here, black to white, white to black. So I'll press Shift A on my keyboard to bring up the add menu. I'm going to add a color invert node, and if I put that right in the middle of that noodle, you can see that it's going to flip the colors around, and now it's going to be white balls or orbs or cells with a black background or black between them. Great. They are still way too clustered and way too big of stars though, so I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard, and I'm going to add a color RGB curves, and if I put this node right in the middle of that noodle and I drag that bottom point by left clicking and dragging inwards, you can start to see the black areas will grow, and I'll make that one a little bit more in and this one more over, just like that. And as you can see, we get some stars, so I can play around with this. I also might want to change the scale, and I can do that right here. The size is set to 0.25 by default. I'll change that to 0.1. You can see I get smaller stars, maybe even 0.05, and I'll press enter. So now I can paint with this texture. I want to make sure that my first color, because if I paint right now, if I select that face, we still have the face select mode turned on right there. If I paint, it's going to have that green overlay, which I don't want, so I'll change this color to 1 for RGB to make it white. I'll press F to make this bigger. We'll change and we have this brush selected right here in the texture area. That's great. I'm going to change the brush mapping. Actually, it is 3D. If it was tiled, it might not paint straight on. It might paint distorted. So there's my starry night. I can press X to get rid of that texture brush. I'll actually press F to make sure that F stands for fake user. And what that will ensure is that if I press this X and nothing else is using that brush at all in this file, and I save and quit Blender, that little F will ensure that Blender does not delete the brush from this file. That fake user will make sure that Blender thinks that there is a user in this file still using that asset, so it does not clean it up from the Blender file when Blender quits. That's important to know. Let's go ahead. We have no more texture brush. Great. Let's go ahead and change the color. And we have mix, and I'll tap F. Let's go ahead and draw the last thing I'm going to draw. I'm going to make it a bit thinner than that. F, and then like that. F. Actually, I just decided I do not want that style of letter F, so I'm going to get rid of, and this is a good excuse to practice using the clone brush. If I make a mistake and I want to erase something from a texture, or if I have a texture spanning multiple faces, and we're going to see this later, where I don't have a very nice seam. Let's say I painted a nice wood grain from one face to a next, but things weren't aligning very well. Or let's say I was making and texturing like a piece of fruit, like an orange, or something like that, or a grapefruit has a nice texture on it, and there was a ugly line across where the two faces were met. I could use what's called the clone brush, and I'll change to it up here. It's called F clone, to get rid of that seam. How you actually use this is your 3D cursor is now placed by holding the control key on your keyboard. If you hold control and left click, you can place it, and wherever this 3D cursor is on the surface of your face is actually where you'll clone from. So now if I tap F on my keyboard to make a bigger brush and I paint, you can see that it's using this location as the basis for my clone brush, and I can paint over. Now I have my strength set not to 1, so I'll press Control Z a few times and turn that up to 1. So now if I left click and drag, I can paint over the F with this texture, and even if I put it somewhere like Control click right there, and I go over this section and I paint over to the right, you can see that it's painting the old version of where that bar of the F was. So I have to make sure I put this by control clicking again, control left click, somewhere where it's not going to run into itself later on. If you're familiar with the clone tool in Photoshop or in GIMP, you'll know what I'm talking about. You have to be careful here, because if you put the 3D cursor somewhere where something is on an angle and you paint, I'm going to actually hold shift and right click on that face as well. It actually paints as you see it. So you can see as I paint like this, you can see that it's painting that face not as a straight on orange background with a D in front of it in blue. It's painting it at an angle, at the same angle that we're seeing it at. That's very, very important. So if I press Control Z once and I maybe go like that, and I press Control and left click and then I paint, you're going to see that maybe I don't get the results that I want. So you might want to be straight on as much as possible when you're using this tool. So I'm going to hold Control and click and just get rid of these few little error areas in the stars, and we're doing pretty good. Let's go ahead and create that F now, but I'm actually going to create a new type of brush. It's going to be using the normal text draw brush, but this time we're not going to use a texture, we're going to use a texture mask. And the difference here can be subtle, but if you're familiar with what a mask is basically a cutout that will allow you to have see-through areas and opaque or solid areas. And basically a mask will let you paint with a stencil or a stamp. That's kind of the best way I can put it, where you can have parts that are not there and parts that are there, if that makes sense. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So I'm actually going to click on New here, and by default we have to make it over here. If I change my option, actually I'll name it over here. I'm going to call it letter F. And so over here I can select brush mask letter F, and by default it's set to an image or a movie. I'm going to use clouds, because clouds in Blender Cycles actually has more options. It has the original Blender original clouds, or you can choose something like voronoi crackle, like that. So let's go ahead and use that. This has dark areas and light areas. That's great for making a mask. We'll customize this using nodes again. So up here under the checkerboard option and with the paintbrush option selected, we'll choose that letter F, and we have to click on use nodes, which will again destroy it. I'm not sure why that is. It defaults to checker whenever you use nodes. I'll select this checker node. I'll press X on my keyboard to get rid of it. I'll press Shift A. I will add a texture and clouds and change that to voronoi crackle and plug this in. I'm going to not use this scale option. I'm actually going to press Shift A because I want to show you that you can actually use distort and scale, and you can use a scale node in the middle of your noodle to scale down a texture if you want. So I'm going to change this to 2 and 2, and we don't need to worry about the Z value because we're only working with X and Y. So the way this works is you would think that the tiles or the crackles would get bigger with 2. It's the other way around. It's how many of the original tile will fit in your new tiles. In this case, 2 makes it 1/4 of the size because 4 of the original squares fit now into the 1 square. So things got smaller with a higher value of 2. Let's go ahead and paint now. Because this is a texture mask, I can now paint with any color I want. I'm going to select red, sure. I'm going to paint over here. We have mix set. We have mask mapping tiled. Notice how with masks we don't get the 3D option, and I'm not sure why that is, but I'll tap F to make this smaller, and I'll write F just like that. If I'm not happy with the scale of this, I can undo it with Control Z, of course, change my scale. In fact, I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to add in a rotate so you can see what that does, and I'll turn this maybe to, you would think it would do degrees, but it does not, so you can see what happens if I do 0.3. I'm going to draw F, and you can see now that those crackles are at an angle, I believe. I don't know if we can really tell. That's good. So we're done with our block letter cube. Let's go ahead and save this. If I go up to File and Save, that's great. But notice how this little star is still here with this image open. If I want to save the image, and I do, I'm going to click on the menu and pack as a PNG again, and then save my file again, just to make sure the image is saved inside the Blender file. Actually, I'm going to end the video right here. So I'm splitting this one long tutorial just for the sake of not having an absurdly long video into 2 parts. In the second part, we're going to create this donut that's on the screen right now using most of the tools that we learned in this tutorial and a few more. So we're going to be using lots of the same painting tools and brush masks and the clone tool to get rid of seams on the donut when I paint a texture in the UV image editor window. Lots of good stuff. But that'll be it for this tutorial. Please go ahead and like this video if you learned something, and click on subscribe to see more videos just like this one in Blender and in tech. Go ahead and check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. That's where I post previews and teasers of what I'm working on next in my tutorial series on this channel. But that'll be it for this one. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.